right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name's Chad Betts. I host interview sessions like this. Tonight, we are going to be talking about getting over COVID, getting back to the workplace. And we have with us Ken Summers, an expert on the topic and in many other things. So I will ask Ken, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Thank you, Chad, and thank you for having me. As Chad said, my name is Ken Summers. I have spent 42 years in human resources field, quite literally all around the planet. Been an expat in 6 countries, and recently retired from the corporate world and established my own freelance practice. And very grateful to have the opportunity to share some things I've learned about preparing for the next normal with the audience and with Chad. So thank you again, Chad.
Great, thanks, Ken. One question that's really come to mind, it's in the news, is the vaccine. Now, do you think that employers will require employees to be vaccinated, and can they do that?
Right. So you're absolutely right. It is a very hot topic, and employers are going to need to walk a tightrope. And the complexity of that tightrope is really rooted in a long-standing principle of U.S. employment law that employers have an obligation to provide a safe working environment. And as we all know, there's more than ample precedent for other kinds of mandatory vaccines. For example, all 50 states have laws requiring certain vaccinations for school-age children. And of course, there are some exemptions. And we won't get into the whole Connecticut drama right now around that. But the EEOC has issued guidance saying that related to COVID, saying that employers can mandate vaccinations as long as they accommodate disabilities or sincerely held religious beliefs. And as you might imagine, that can get a little tricky, but the EEOC has basically said for the vast majority of employees, employers can mandate vaccinations. Now, what makes that tricky is that the vaccinations we have available right now have been authorized for emergency use only. If the FDA, and there's a lot of speculation that the FDA will do this soon, but if they certify that the vaccines are safe for routine use, the case for mandatory vaccination policies becomes much easier to defend. So to try to sum that up, it's watch and wait, be thoughtful if you take action in the near term. But once the FDA authorizes these vaccines for routine use, it'll be much easier to defend a mandate.
Now, would they be required to show proof? I mean, the concept of the passport or whatnot. How would that work with the employer?
Right. So it would be it's a logical extension to say that if an employer is requiring a vaccination, that there be some evidence of that vaccination. And that's okay. Here's where it gets tricky. If all you collect is factual information, yes, the person's vaccinated or no, they're not, you're probably okay. If you start collecting other information, you run the risk of running afoul of the health privacy rules, commonly known as HIPAA. So if, as an employer, you want to capture that information, it's probably okay. I always say to check with your employment counsel because every employer is unique and their circumstances are unique. But as a general principle, you can require evidence of vaccination as long as that's all you're doing. Don't collect information about any reactions they had or any pre-existing conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because then you run the risk of violating those HIPAA laws.
All right, so we can see in healthcare, there's requirements there. Are we going to see it in other areas, or are we just talking theoretically?
Well, so this is purely personal opinion, but I would say what we've come to know as frontline workers, it's going to be fairly common, I believe, to either require vaccination or evidence of vaccination because they have such direct interaction with the broad public. And Although some of the states have enacted legislation that protects employers from suits. For example, I went to ShopRite and I was exposed to someone who had COVID and I came down with it. I became very sick and now I'm a COVID long hauler. Obviously an extreme example, but not out of the realm of possibility.
Mhm.
Many states have issued laws at this point insulating employers from those kinds of suits, as long as they've taken reasonable steps to protect the public, protect their staff. So again, I think to answer your question more directly, Chad, I think that it's more likely we'll see it in frontline worker situations. Healthcare is an example, but I know that a lot of healthcare institutions have come out and said they will not mandate vaccinations. So we'll see how that might change once the FDA certifies the vaccines as routine.
So that seems to be the key. So right now that it's, in the experimental use, it's, pushing people to do that. That goes above and beyond, it seems.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
All right. Well, the vaccine's only one part of the whole, pie. In the planning to come back, what are some of the things that we should, put in that plan, to bring our employees back to the office?
Sure. So there's no requirement to have a plan, particularly, or a written plan in particular. Having said that, if you're an employer of any size, and I'm thinking, 10, 15 people or more, I would recommend a written return to work plan. And I do that for a few reasons. One is it enables you to document the operating procedures you will follow once people are back in the work environment. And that then becomes a reference document. And if and when you encounter resistance or outright non-compliance, which is going to happen, it's already happening, having a written and, importantly, a communicated plan will strengthen your position to enforce that plan. And if it becomes necessary, unfortunately, that would give you the strength of the documentation, will give you the strength to discipline non-compliant employees up to and including termination.
So is there a way to use a plan to smooth reentry as well? I understand the needs for it to be there and for people to comply. But so people aren't coming back to, you need to do this. Is there a way to kind of smooth it in so that, people can feel comfortable coming back as well?
Right. Well, that bleeds into, the things that we should be considering when you do build a plan. Mm-hmm. And the first and most important thing I'll say about that is follow and stick with the latest CDC guidance. And the CDC guidance, as you probably are aware, is updated all the time. There's not a schedule per se, but it's something that has to be paid attention to. And generally speaking, if you follow the CDC guidance, you're going to be compliant. But there's a number of questions that any employer needs to ask themselves when they're thinking about building a plan. Start with, who needs to be in the workplace? Mm-hmm. Do all the people need to be there? Can some of the people be there? And you have to, and it sounds trickier than it is trickier than it may sound, because you have to be thoughtful about the criteria that you'll use to make those decisions. And in doing so, it's important to remember that all the laws regarding workplace discrimination and the matters related to workplace discrimination have not, and I underscore not, been suspended during COVID. So if you inadvertently create a discriminatory situation in how you bring people back to the office, that's a risk. So the environment is tricky and getting trickier, which is another good reason to have a thoughtful plan. I'm happy to continue on that, Chad, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Did you see the McKinsey report today on this?
I haven't seen today's report, but please share.
They did a survey of 1,400 different companies, and they said that productivity is down 20% because of the chaos of not knowing what the new norm really is.
Yeah.
High anxiety, low productivity.
Yep. And the mental health dimension of this, the anxiety, I mean, we could probably spend an hour just talking about that. But I'm not at all surprised to hear that. Um, there was an earlier McKinsey report about a week ago, and if I remember the statistics correctly, something on the order of 30% of the people they surveyed have said, I never want to go back to an office. So employers are going to be dealing with a very different landscape as the new normal or the next normal emerges. But just continuing along this line, Chad, as you're thinking about your plan, you do need to anticipate what reasonable accommodations you can make.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, have to be really careful about being consistent in granting those accommodations and administering them. Again,
the administrating piece, that's good, because we just had a question come in about communicating the plan. What's the best way to communicate that plan, especially since we have people everywhere?
A lot. I would do it both in a written form, distribute the document to employees, but I would also hold meetings. And Zoom is fine. Zoom or any of the competing products is a perfectly acceptable way to demonstrate that you've communicated the plan. And in communicating, it creates an opportunity for employees to ask questions, get clarification, express concerns, etc., all of which are important to an employer as they consider the logistics of building a plan. I hope that answers.
What are some of the logistics you would go into that plan?
Sure. So some of the things I've already mentioned, I would encourage employers to expect to spend more time on engagement. To the point just made about a large percentage of people are losing productivity over their anxiety. One of the best ways to deal with that is to engage with your employees. Regular, transparent communications. Tell them what you know. Tell them what you don't know. Be honest, be open as much as you can. Obviously, you don't give away trade secrets, but also as part of that engagement, train people on whatever safety protocols you're going to put in place as you move towards reopening. Continuing on that, another logistical point is anticipate and build a COVID prevention plan. Think about how people might be exposed in the workplace. Think about, do I need physical distancing rules? Do I need to mandate masks in the office or on the floor of the business? And I'm sure you can all think of many more examples, but thinking that through, anticipating the kinds of questions that will come up, as well as the risk of exposures under different circumstances, because let's face it, we're going to struggle as a nation to get to 70% or 80% vaccination. And I'm not making a political statement. I think it's an observation of fact.
Mm-hmm.
Some other things to consider in the logistical things, think about and decide on a screening and testing protocol. And don't forget, again, there are privacy considerations around testing and the test results. There's the HIPAA considerations that I already mentioned. And if you happen to be a business that is subject to the European Union general data privacy rules, you have to think about that. Because the GDPR administrators are looking at how companies are dealing with the medical data and other personal data that becomes exposed as a result of working with employees on COVID reentry.
It's very complex. So with all these logistical issues, combined with the idea that who you ask back with discriminatory or disability discrimination, should you have a staggered return to work, or are there too many challenges with that?
I think it depends on the business. It's really hard to answer that in the absolute. If I'm a retail business, I probably spend a lot of time figuring out my staffing patterns and how many people I need on different shifts, et cetera. An environment like that where the management team is accustomed to scheduling and who comes when and who works when, it may be an easier transition than it would be for an office environment where history is everybody shows up unless they're sick or on vacation or some other situation. So I'd love to give you a finite answer, but I think there's too many it depends to give a generic response to that.
No, that's fair. But a question from here: what if somebody disagrees and doesn't want to come back?
Well, it gets tricky. There is guidance from the government that if someone refuses to return to work, it can be grounds for termination. However, and this is a big however, the government and the various regulatory agencies have also made clear in that guidance that termination should be an action of last resort. And an action of second last resort would be to consider some kind of leave. And the FMLA leave is going to be the most common one that would be used. But if there's no other way to deal with it, if there's no other way to accommodate, if a leave won't work and someone just refuses to return to work, the guidance is the termination is an option. Nobody wants that, of course, but the government has basically said, if you have to, okay.
Well, that opens up to the question of hybridity, the hybrid model, people in and out of the office trying to accommodate as best as possible. What are your views on that hybrid model?
I'm a big fan. I'm a huge fan, actually. I think that it recognizes the reality that we're living in now and the reality that we're likely to have for quite some time. Now, there are people, I guess Jamie Dimon is probably the most visible example, has come out and said, I want all my people back in the office. Mm-hmm. And I want them back in the office because collaboration in person is different than collaboration remotely. But again, we could spend a lot of time on this subject alone. But there are things to pay attention to as you're building a hybrid plan. What are some examples? Obviously, how many people do I have in the office when, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I worry about, and there's some early research on this, recent article in the Harvard Business Review, for example, that having some people remote and some people in the office, even if it's on a rotating basis, is going to create a very different power dynamic in the workplace. And thinking through what the implications of that new power dynamic will be is really important. It may not surface in the first 6 months, but I can promise you that it will surface. People who are going to work remotely all or most of the time really need to build their soft skills, their ability to interact, their ability to read body language, which is best in person. Video is okay, but it's not the same thing. What happens to the manager who is accustomed to bumping into someone at the water cooler or at the coffee machine, and he or she has a project to assign, and gee, I bumped into Sally at the coffee machine. I think I'll give it to Sally, not remembering that Joe is working at home and Joe is equally capable of executing that project. So there's a lot of hair on that. And thinking it through, protecting against inadvertent discriminatory decisions, and doing things to help the remote people be more effective remotely are things that have to be taken into consideration if you want a successful hybrid plan.
Yeah, I guess we had to change. It used to be 80% of success was showing up. Yes. So that's we had to redefine what showing up means.
Exactly.
How do we do that? I mean, is that a training piece, or is it a complete just change of attitude, or what do we need?
Well, I will tell you, it's going to have to come from the top of the organization. And this is where I think my colleagues in human resources have an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. Because most CEOs probably aren't sitting at home or at their desk thinking about how do I take care of my hybrid people? And that's where the HR person comes in to flag the issue, be a thought partner, figure out what are the implications for their business and how are they going to best do it. But I think because there's so many soft behavioral issues that will be attached to a hybrid environment, it's really important that it be led from the top, that senior leadership of an organization think it through in partnership with their HR people and communicate a clear, articulate plan that makes sense, and then actually execute on the plan. Because this is one where all the nice words in the world won't mean a thing if you can't execute that plan and do it consistently.
And that plan goes beyond the people, right? So, I mean, you have the real estate, you have the technology. You know, how do you manage that kind of plan with integrating all of that?
Oh yeah, it's again another layer of complexity. I have a client who has a lease that expires sometime next year, and he's already thinking about, gee, do I need the same amount of space? Today he has hard wall offices. He's thinking, well, maybe we should go to cubicles and let people rotate through cubicles. And oh, by the way, I can occupy a smaller space and save some money. And he's far from unique. The last time I looked, something like 20% of the office space in Manhattan was available for lease, because there's been an exodus of people from Manhattan, and companies are realizing they just don't need as much space. That will spread. That will be every major city will be impacted. Even Boston, which has got a building boom, the likes of which I've seldom seen. They're starting to worry, what are we going to do with all this space that we're creating?
Now, one thing too, with now going back to the people, how do you build teams in isolation? I mean, that's probably the biggest challenge. How do you have a cohesive team when people aren't together?
Right. And again, this comes back to the philosophy that will come hopefully from the top of the organization. People managers are going to need to be trained on how to do this. It's a great question, Chad. It's another one we could spend a whole session on. I think the big thing or the most immediate thing that I would want to see people managers get better at is just plain old-fashioned open communication with their people. All of us have worked in corporate environments, and I'm sure that all of us can think of multiple examples where you either had a manager or you knew of a manager who maybe was technically great, but was terrible at the people dimension of their job. Didn't communicate well, performance reviews were surprises. You can think of many examples. Mm-hmm. We have to make our frontline people managers more adept at navigating human issues, because that's going to be part of the new management job. That's my prediction, at least. So, lead from the top, implement at the front line, and make sure your middle management team knows what they can do, what they can't do, and that they have a responsibility to actually lead their management teams in making sure that you retain and make your investment in human capital productive.
Are there any sleeper issues, things that we're just not thinking about that we really should be?
I can think of many sleeper issues. Let me go through some of them. First of all, we talked a lot about having a back to the office plan or back to the workplace plan. I will tell you, plan on that plan needing to be iterated. This will not be a one and done matter, because the environment is going to continue to evolve. Hopefully we won't have additional waves here, but even if we stabilize, things are going to change and they will continue to change. So don't lock a plan in stone, because you're going to need to change it. Think about things like we just talked about, culture and collaboration. How do we maintain the culture that we want and ensure that people are collaborating when they do come together less frequently. One of the participants made a comment about productivity in the McKinsey study. We're going to need new data on how are people as productive when they work remotely as they are in the office. What are the implications of that for performance measurements, and how do we evaluate success? We talked a little bit about equity and potential discrimination, but I'll double click on it. Who is and who's not permitted to work remotely? Are there particular identifiable groups that are more likely to be required to work in the office? Are we creating a class system where lower paid workers need to be in the office or in the workplace while the higher paid people are not? Think of the ShopRite example. If we require the frontline workers to come and run the cash registers and stock the shelves, but the executives can stay at home, what does that say about the culture of the organization? And does it create the risk of a discriminatory situation? There are wage and hour issues. How do we make sure that non-exempt remote people properly track their time, take the required meal and rest breaks, and are paid for overtime? And what about the short periods of work outside the normal workday to check and respond to emails or perform other brief work-related activities? So lots of wage and hour issues. We mentioned earlier confidentiality of information. Think of it in another dimension. Think of it from a technology point of view. What protocols do I need as a business to implement to make sure that my confidential data, my proprietary information is protected when some or all of my employees are remote? How do I make sure that that information doesn't make its way to a third party that I don't want to have it? I'm going to continue for another moment or two.
Please.
Expectations. Do flexible work arrangements contemplate that people can take off time during the regular workday to attend to personal matters and make up the work at a more convenient time? Think about people who still have children, school-age children at home, and if they need to take a break to tutor their daughter on a reading exercise. Or are employees expected to be online and available throughout the regular workday? Something that you have to think about, plan, and communicate what your policy is going to be. Home office expenses. Are there home office expenses that you either have to or want to reimburse, such as computer, internet, cell phone, etc.? And note, and this is important to note, that there are significant variations from state to state in the legal requirements regarding expense reimbursement obligations. Workplace safety. What obligations will an employer have to ensure that remote workers have a safe workplace, including the ergonomics of their home office? And then we get to the fun thing of taxes and the implications related to that. If my work office location is remote and my employer is a Connecticut employer, but I live in Massachusetts, do I have an obligation on tax withholding? Do I need to be registered to do business in Massachusetts? All kinds of hairy tax implications. Some other ones are going back to the people dimension of this. Think about how are you going to make decisions when some people are in the office and others are remote. Mm-hmm. If you're accustomed to doing the coffee machine chit chat that will lead to a business decision, and half your team is remote, you have to think about what are the implications of making decisions that way. We talked about communications effectiveness, and I'll say it again, the ability to read body language is easier in person. It just is. And we talked about some of the power issues. The reality is the physical proximity influences perceptions. And I mentioned the example of a project needing to be assigned. Are you more likely to give that project to someone that you bumped into in the work environment, or are you going to think of Sally or Joe who happens to be working at home that week?
Now, are these issues, do you see them, are they potentially company destroying issues? I mean, are these, Can there be a material impact on the bottom line, or are these just bumps in the road?
I believe that they are talent destructive issues. And to the extent that you are a business that is reliant on key persons or an environment where there's a lot of direct customer interaction, I think there's even more pressure to get this right, because how you treat your people will be reflected in how they treat their customers. And again, I have a client who it's a relatively small organization. One of their people has quit for a better opportunity, and we're all very happy for her. But because it's a small organization, she is a key person on the team. And we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how do we replace that capability in an environment where a lot of people are still worried about coming back to the office, or are tree hugging the existing jobs because they're worried about what the future holds.
Yeah. So how does that affect the planning? I mean, there are what, 8.2 million jobs unfilled right now. There's people are talking about all the different reasons why people aren't going back to work. We don't have to go into it, but some people don't seem to want to go back. How does that impact planning? I mean, how do you require someone to get vaccinated when well, if I'm not going to get vaccinated, I won't go back. But you need that person. How do you deal with that?
So a lot of this, I think, can and will need to be addressed by what I think of as Human Resources 101. Knowing your population, knowing who your key people are, making sure that you are engaging your key people, making sure that they have every opportunity to continue to be successful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Turnover is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I have many colleagues over the years who have chastised me for saying this, but in a good sized organization, I've always held the belief that a turnover level of 5 to 8% is probably healthy for an organization in the long run. Pardon me. That is probably less true in the immediate environment and in the near term, because organizations really need to think about, where do I have talent risk, and how is that talent risk complicated by the COVID environment, by a reluctance to return to the workplace, and 7 or 8 other reasons, and making sure that you proactively reach out, engage, again, I'll use that word again, engage your key people, know what's on their mind, give them a chance to express what's concerning them, and do your best to address it, especially if you're a key person dependent on those people.
Yeah, from our conversation, it really sounds like if we don't have commitment from the highest levels of management, that success is going to be very difficult in the transition back.
I think so. I think that this is one of those unique situations where leadership from the top is imperative. Sure, enlightened middle and frontline managers can do a lot, but their sphere of influence is limited by definition. And these are enterprise level issues, whether it's a 5-person mom and pop retail operation, or it's a 1,000-person manufacturing company. You want the right messages coming from the right people, and your leader and your management team implementing consistently.
Now, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but just bringing it all together, the politics of the office, the operation hierarchies, the interactions, bringing it all together. How do you address office politics in this type of environment?
Yeah. So what I would do if I was, the lead HR person in an organization is I'd get my senior management team together. I'd start with the top dog first, get him or her on board, but bring the leadership team together and talk about it. and get them to help the CEO or the president identify the issues. Where are we today? Where do we want to be? And have a plan to transition from point A to point B. And you won't think of everything. Stuff will come up. You're going to have to react because that's the world we live in. But as a starting point to get the team together and as a team, think through what are the implications for the business and how do we address them is where I would begin.
Okay. Now we're down to our last 5 minutes and we want to leave some time for questions. Do you have any final thoughts before we end the recording?
I guess the only thing I would say is that, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. I hope that the information I've shared has been of value to the participants. I think the bottom line is, and I'm glad you asked that last question, Chad, is that the leadership team of these businesses need to, if they haven't already, think about what are all the implications of bringing people back into the workplace, the safety issues, the employment relation issues, the communication issues, the how are we going to manage people? What does success look like in the next normal? The list is long. It's not easy, but it's important, I believe, to look at it from a people and talent management point of view, because for most organizations, it really is true that people are a very important asset. And if you get the people stuff wrong, your recovery as a business will be inhibited.
Great. Well, Ken, thank you.